Hi, everybody. You're listening to Comics and History, episode number 103, part 2, Spotlight on Green Lantern Alan Scott in the Copper Age, continued. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Brian J. Rygate, and class is back from recess. In part 1 of episode 103, I was talking about the origin of Green Lantern Yalen Gur as depicted in issue number 19 from volume 3 of Green Lantern back in 1990. And one of the problems I had with the Yalen Gur origin story was the suggestion that Yalen Gur's spirit influenced the design of Alan Scott's costume. I didn't like that because both in Alan's first appearance in All-American Comics number 16, as well as in a variety of stories that were told over the past 30 years, it was Alan who designed his costume by himself. He deliberately made it a very garish looking costume because he wanted people to remember who he was. He especially wanted criminals to remember what he looked like, so it would serve as a warning to them to stay out of trouble. And in certain other stories, I'm thinking of one that was written by Christopher Priest, Alan even chided himself for not really thinking his fashion sense through when he was designing a costume that had so many colors. So the implication here that Yalen Gur's costume design inspired Alan's didn't sit entirely well with me. I've heard other comics fans say likewise. But again, to see a story that was illustrated by Alan's original penciler, Martin Odell, a really nice treat. And going forward, certainly after Zero Hour, as well as other crisis level events, I don't think that the Yalen Gur story stayed intact going forward. Certainly for this period, it was considered an important part of Alan Scott's origin, but it's not a story that I've heard referred to in more recent years. And in fact, the concept of the Yalen Gur origin replacing the Starheart origin that was first written by Denny O'Neil and then confirmed by Roy Thomas. The O'Neil-Thomas story of the Starheart would later be brought back into Alan's post-crisis history. But for now, Alan Scott was still considered on the shelf because issue 19 of Green Lantern ended with Hal and John Stewart, at least, telling Molly that they would do everything in their power to bring Alan back. Guy was an A1 jerk to Molly in this issue, and I'm thinking that when Alan did eventually return to our plane of existence, either Molly never told him just how mean Guy was to her, or it happened off panel where Alan perhaps smacked Guy around and said, "You never treat my wife like that again, you jerk." In any event, Alan Scott would not be heard of again for the better part of 2 years. And this brings us to the Armageddon 2001 storyline. And it's one of those stories that often gets laughed at for rather unfortunate reason. And so I do want to take some time to talk about Armageddon 2001 because it certainly had a really neat concept to it. The concept was this. Sometime in the future of the DC universe, maybe 20 years into the future, the entire hero community had been wiped out by a villainous despot known as Monarch, who established complete power over the entire Earth. And not much was known about Monarch. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody knew where he came from. All that was known was that the Monarch had at one time been a hero in the DC universe. And something had happened that caused this unknown or unnamed hero to take a fall and become the Monarch. And it was shown that Monarch was quite interested in various sciences, basically anything to expand and ensure his complete and total control of the Earth and perhaps even beyond. And so one of his initiatives involved the study of time. And so he was looking for a human test subject for his experiments in time and chronal energy, and he found a volunteer and a young scientist named Matthew Ryder. And so Ryder was bombarded by various forms of chronal energy. He was transformed into the time-traveling being composed purely of chronal energy known as Wave Rider. And not only that, but much like Nathaniel Adams / Captain Atom before him, Wave Rider found himself shot through time. Unlike Captain Atom, however, Wave Rider was sent back in time, specifically to the year 1991. And it was there that Wave Rider realized that, given the nature of his powers, he could basically make physical contact and scan the minds of every hero in the DCU. And in so doing, he could look into their futures, thereby finding out which hero it was who had their tragic downfall and became the Monarch. And in so doing, Wave Rider could take actions of his own that would lead to the prevention of that hero having a downfall and becoming the Monarch. Unfortunately, though, Wave Rider's meddling in the year 1991 would act as a sort of a beacon for Monarch in his time to come back to 1991, where he would stay and begin his reign of terror a good 2 decades earlier. So pretty neat concept. It was bookended by Armageddon 2001, issues 1 and 2, issue 1 being the introduction, issue 2 being the conclusion. And the body of the story was told in all of that year's annuals. It was really neat to see all these possible futures for all of the DC heroes. And these stories actually showed that Wave Rider's power to scan people's minds and see into the future wasn't quite perfect, because thanks to the fact that there were multiple Superman titles, Wave Rider scanned Superman more than once and found that there were actually more than one possible future for Superman. Now, in neither possible future did Wave Rider see Superman becoming Monarch, and so he had to really go through everyone within the DCU. And as the story was progressing, Captain Atom at one point made his leave of the other heroes, said he had to go somewhere, and seemed rather suspicious. And readers had good reason to suspect that it was Captain Atom who would become the Monarch, because that was the ending that DC had planned. And it made sense, given events that were going on in Captain Atom's solo title as well as his appearances in other books, such as Justice League Europe. Here's the problem. Early days of the internet, somehow the ending of Armageddon 2001 got leaked, and the fandom heard all about it. Now, 2017, you may be listening to this thinking, well, big deal. Comics companies spoil major storylines, plot twists, conclusions. It's all about creating hype and getting people to buy the next book or the next series. But this was 1991, and spoiling the end, or rather leaking the end of Armageddon 2001 was not what DC had intended. So it left the company with a lot of proverbial egg on its face. And so instead of sucking it up and trying to put a spin on it like, okay, fans, yes, you know how it ends, but you're going to want to see what comes next, DC Editorial decided that a new ending had to be written. And so it was written and released. And so in Armageddon number 2, the breach opens, the Monarch walks through, and he confronts Wave Rider, who is joined by Hawk, a.k.a. Hank Hall, and Dove, a.k.a. Dawn Granger. And the Monarch is gloating about how he's been able to travel back in time, and so he can start his rise that much earlier. Hawk and Dove intervene. Monarch blasts Dove, kills her, drives Hawk into a berserker rage. Enough of a rage that Hawk not only pummels Monarch, he kills him. And then Hawk rips off the Monarch's helmet and learns the terrible truth. Monarch is an older Hank Hall. And so a very despondent, distressed Hank Hall takes off his Hawk costume and he dons the armaments of the Monarch, and he says, well, this is who I am now. So the story ended this way with a time paradox or a predestination loop in which it appeared that in a great case of a cosmic which came first, the chicken or the egg, Hank Hall was destined from the outset to be the Monarch. And it really gave a tragic element to the Monarch in that he didn't mean to be villainous. Hank Hall never had this outlook that he was one day going to become a villain. It was the shock of seeing his future self that drove him to become the Monarch. And this time it drove him to become the Monarch at least 10 years before he was supposed to. Well, this did not sit well with DC fans. First off, they pointed to the Hawk and Dove annual, in which Wave Rider said there was no way that Hank Hall could become the Monarch, even though his powers seemed to be wonky, what with him seeing multiple possible futures for Superman. Fans just weren't buying it. Plus, I think a lot of fans in 91 wanted to see an A-list or at least a B+ hero become Monarch. At the time, Hawk is probably seen more of as a B- or C+ level hero, whereas Captain Atom was a pretty prominent character back in 1991. There was a lot going on in his book and in the Justice League books. And so at that time, Captain Atom, I would say, was certainly at least an A- level hero. So fans felt cheated in that regard. The ending seemed too hasty. It conflicted with the story which had already been published so far. And it left DC scrambling. How could they possibly make up for the stink of what was supposed to be one of the greatest events ever. And just as a quick aside, it wasn't until